In a cave in northern Spain, a team from Uppsala University pulled DNA from 8 people who had been buried more than 5,000 years ago. When the results came back, one population on the modern map matched them almost perfectly. Not the Spanish, not the French, the Basques. 8 people who, to this day, speak a language related to nothing else on Earth. Those bones had been holding a secret for 5,000 years. And it rewrites where Europe's oldest people actually came from, northern Spain. A cave called El Portalón, tucked inside the Atapuerca Hills, a limestone maze that has been swallowing bones for hundreds of thousands of years. Atapuerca is one of the richest fossil sites on the planet, a place that has handed archaeologists some of the oldest human remains ever found in Western Europe. That is where the modern story begins. Here is what makes the finding almost impossible. For most of Europe, ancestry is a story of being overwritten. Foragers gave way to farmers. Farmers gave way to herders out of the east. Then Rome, and everyone who came after Rome, poured through and left their mark in the blood. Trace almost any European alive today, and you are tracing layers of newcomers, stacked one on top of the last. But the Basques break the pattern. Their language answers to nothing in the Indo-European family, the family that gave us English, Spanish, Russian, and Hindi alike. Their blood carries markers that show up nowhere else on the continent at the same strength. And their oldest bones, the ones from that cave, line up with the living population better than anywhere else in Europe. So the question stopped being a curiosity and became a real scientific problem. How does a people survive, more or less intact, while the whole continent around them is rewritten again and again? Modern genetics has been circling that question for over a decade, and the answer it keeps arriving at is the one almost nobody expected. Start with the cave, because that is where the evidence starts. In the year 2015, a group led by Torsten Gunther and Matthias Jakobsen at Uppsala University in Sweden recovered whole genomes from 8 people buried at El Portalón. A genome is the full set of genetic instructions carried in a single body, the entire book, not a single page. These were not cavemen with clubs. They were early farmers, people who kept animals, ground grain, and buried their loved ones with care. And they lived between roughly 3,500 and 5,500 years ago. Reading DNA that old is its own small miracle. After thousands of years in the ground, the genetic material has broken into tiny fragments and soaked up contamination from everything that touched it since. To trust a result, the lab has to sequence the same fragments over and over, sift out the modern smudges, and rebuild the ancient code piece by broken piece. It is closer to forensics than to biology, a crime scene tens of centuries cold. Then came the comparison. The team lined up these ancient farmers against every living European population they could get their hands on, hunting for their closest living relatives alive today. And one group pulled ahead of all the others. The modern Basques, not close. Closest, of everyone alive in Europe today, the people of the Basque country sit nearest to the farmers who were buried in that Spanish cave 5,000 years ago. There was a second layer to it too. Those ancient farmers were themselves a blend. They carried the ancestry of the first farming families that spread across Europe, mixed with the older hunting people who had lived on the land long before them. So the Basques are not the leftovers of a single frozen tribe. They are the living descendants of that early fusion, carried forward, almost undiluted, into the present day. Think about how rare that is. Deep European ancestry usually calls up cave painters, or Roman soldiers, or Vikings, faces that vanished long ago. The Basques are the closest thing on the continent to that first farming world. Still walking around, still raising children, still ordering lunch. A door into prehistory that never quite shut. That alone was enough to make headlines. But it opened a harder question, and it is the question this whole story turns on. If the rest of Europe kept changing, why didn't they? To answer that, you have to listen to how the Basques speak, because the language is where this gets strange. It is called Euskara, and linguists have a blunt word for what it is: an isolate. That means it has no known relatives, living or extinct. English has cousins in German and Dutch. Spanish has sisters in Italian and French. Euskara has nobody. It stands completely alone. Almost every language spoken across Europe and much of Asia belongs to one enormous family called Indo-European, which spread out of a single ancient source thousands of years ago and splintered into hundreds of tongues. Euskara is the great exception in Western Europe, the only language that was here before that wave arrived and is still spoken on the same soil today. Roughly 1 million people speak it right now, in the green valleys where Spain and France meet the Atlantic, and it does not just sound different. It is built differently. It stacks small pieces onto its words to change their meaning, a method almost nothing around it uses. Even the way it counts leans on the number 20 rather than 10, a habit older than the systems that surround it. Over the centuries, it did borrow, of course. It took in words from Latin and from Spanish for kings, for peace, for the new tools and ideas that arrived from outside. But it borrowed the way a strong house takes in furniture. The walls, the grammar, the deep bones of the language stayed entirely its own. This is not a dialect of anything. It is a survivor from a Europe that otherwise no longer exists. We can even watch its family tree run backward in time. Long before Euskara was written down, the Romans recorded names from a people called the Aquitanians, just north of the Pyrenees in what is now southern France. Names carved on altars and gravestones. Andre, for a woman. Nescado, for a girl. Words a Basque speaker can still nearly recognize 2,000 years later. Linguists now treat that old Aquitanian tongue as the direct ancestor of Basque, which means the language was already here, already itself, when Caesar's legions marched past. Sit with what that means. The Romans came and conquered and left Latin behind in every province they held, from Portugal to Romania. Latin grew into Spanish, French, Italian, and a dozen others. And in one pocket of the Western Pyrenees, the old language simply refused to disappear. It watched an empire rise, spread, and fall, and it kept talking. So now there are two mysteries sitting side by side. The oldest bones match the living people. The oldest language outlived everything around it. And here's where the DNA and the language seem to crash straight into each other. About 4,500 years ago, a new people swept into Europe from the grasslands north of the Black Sea. Herders who had learned to live off horses and cattle on the open plain. They brought metal, they brought the wheel, and they almost certainly brought the Indo-European languages themselves. Genetically, they hit Europe like a flood. In parts of the continent, most of the male bloodline was replaced within a few centuries. And they reached the Basques too. This is the part people expect to be the twist that ruins the story. It isn't. In the year 2019, a team including Inigo Olalde and David Reich at Harvard published a sweeping study in the journal Science, reading 8,000 years of DNA from the Iberian Peninsula. The steppe ancestry is right there in the Basques. Their Y chromosome, the strand of DNA passed only father to son, is dominated by a single lineage called R1b at around 87%. That signature traces straight back to those eastern herders. So the newcomers' blood arrived, but the language never left. That is the paradox that makes this population so strange. Almost everywhere else, when the steppe genes came in, the old languages faded out and Indo-European took their place. Among the ancestors of the Basques, the genes came in, and the language held its ground. Something shielded it. And the same something, it turns out, is written all through their DNA. There's a tell in exactly which part of it changed. That R1b signature rides on the Y chromosome, the male line, passed father to son. The herders who carried it were mostly men, and across Europe, their arrival overwrote the male line far more heavily than the female one. But the mitochondrial DNA, a separate genetic thread that runs mother to daughter, unbroken for thousands of years, tells a gentler story. In the Basques, those maternal lines run older and more local, reaching back past the herders to the farming women and the foraging women before them who never left. The fathers changed. The mothers, in a sense, stayed. The Olalde study made the contrast painfully clear. Across the rest of the peninsula, the story never stopped. After the herders came Phoenician traders, then Greeks, then Rome, then centuries of gene flow across the Mediterranean and from North Africa. Wave after wave, each one leaving a new layer in the DNA of ordinary Spaniards and Portuguese. The Basques caught the early part of that story, and then, at some point, they stepped out of it. The later waves that reshaped everyone else mostly passed them by. If a people outlasting an empire with nothing but their own stubbornness is the kind of story you came here for, take a second and subscribe. This channel walks into these places every week, where the newest science meets the oldest questions we have. Now, back to the thing that shielded them, because the first clue did not come from a cave or a lab at all. It came from a hospital. Long before anyone could read a genome, doctors already knew something was different about Basque blood. In the middle of the 20th century, researchers taking blood samples across Europe kept getting a strange reading from the Basque country. It had the highest rate of a certain blood type anywhere on the continent, Rh negative. The large majority of people on Earth are Rh positive, carrying a particular protein on their red blood cells. A minority are Rh negative and lack it. Across Europe, the negative type sits at around 1 in 6. Among Basques, it climbs to as high as 1 in 3, a concentration found nowhere else. They also carry unusually high rates of blood group O. At the time, Nobody could explain it. It looked like a fluke of geography, but it was the first hard clue that this population had been sitting apart from its neighbors for a very, very long time, marrying mostly among themselves, letting rare traits pile up instead of washing away. Blood was whispering what DNA would later say out loud. Modern DNA turned that hint into a timeline. In the year 2021, a study led by Lair Flores Bello and David Comas, published in the journal Current Biology, went inside the Basque country itself. And it found something quietly stunning. The Basques were not one smooth, uniform people. They were a patchwork of valleys, each one drifting slightly apart from the next. Exactly the fingerprint you see in a population that stopped taking in outsiders and turned inward on itself. The best estimate for when that door closed points to the Iron Age, very roughly 2,500 years ago. After that, while the rest of Iberia kept swallowing wave after wave, the Basques largely stopped mixing. The rest of Spain kept being rewritten. The Basques did not. And behind that closed door, the old blood and the old words kept right on going, generation after generation, valley after valley, while the centuries piled up outside. The mountains did most of the work. The Western Pyrenees are steep, wet, and hard to farm, with little to tempt a conquering army into settling for good. Rome reached the Basques, traded with them, even recruited from them, but never truly replaced them the way it replaced so many others. The legions marched through the valleys and left the people in them more or less alone. Every empire that came afterward found the same thing: easy to pass, not worth staying. And so the door, once closed, was very hard to force back open. And then, in the year 2021, a hand reached back out of that closed room. On a hillside called Irulegi, near Pamplona, archaeologists sifting through the ruins of an ancient hilltop town lifted a flat sheet of bronze out of the dirt, shaped like a human hand. It had belonged to a people the Romans called the Vascones, the Iron Age ancestors, many linked directly to the Basques. It was about 2,100 years old, and it was covered in writing. The very first word, scratched into the metal, reads Sorioneku. To a modern Basque speaker, that is almost readable. It is a breath away from the living word Zorioneko. It means, roughly, of good fortune. Lucky, sit with that for a moment. A word lifted from the hand of someone who lived 2,000 years ago, in the shadow of the Roman legions, and a person from those same valleys today can very nearly read it aloud. The empire that surrounded that hand is dust. The language carved onto it is not. It went to work this morning. It ordered coffee. It put children to bed. That single bronze hand did something the bones and the blood could only suggest. It proved the language was already in those valleys, recognizably itself, 2,000 years ago, reaching across all that time to speak directly to the people who live there now. When the discovery was announced, it made headlines across the Basque country, and you can understand why. For once, the ancestors had not just left bones and blood, they had left a word, and it was a word their descendants could still read. So put the pieces together, the way the scientists finally did. The Basques are not a lost tribe, frozen since the Ice Age. Whatever the old legends claimed, their real origin is stranger, and honestly more impressive than that. They are the living descendants of the first farmers of Europe, the people in that Spanish cave. They took in the newcomers who followed, the steppe herders and their bloodline, and then, at some point, they simply stopped. They pulled back into their mountains and held on. And what they held on to, the language, the blood, the memory of who was here first, outlasted everything that rolled over the rest of the continent. That is what actually gets rewritten here. For a long time, the textbook story of Europe was almost entirely a story of replacement, one people erasing the last, over and over, until nothing old survived. The Basques are the living proof that the story was never that simple. At least one thread held. One people carried the deep past forward without breaking it. And they are still here, on the same land, speaking the same impossible language, to remind us that continuity, not just conquest, is part of the human story too. Those 8 skeletons in El Portalón were never the end of the line. They were the near shore of an unbroken thread that runs straight into a living town. A thread you can still hear every time a child in Bilbao or Bayonne says "good morning" in a language older than Latin, older than Greek, older than almost anything else still spoken in Europe. But that thread pulls on one more question, and it is the one geneticists are chasing right now. If the Basques are the last living piece of the first Europe, then who exactly were those first farmers before they ever reached that cave? Follow their line back far enough, and it walks out of Europe entirely, toward a homeland that is only now coming into focus. That is the next one. For now, sit with this. A people outlasted empires without firing a shot. kept alive by nothing more than mountains, stubbornness, and a language that would not be silenced. If that is the kind of story you came for, subscribe, and I will keep bringing you the oldest questions we have, answered with the newest science we have got. I will see you in the next one.